The mountain settlement of Pine Ridge had grown quickly that year, perhaps too quickly. Families arrived weekly throughout the summer months, drawn by promises of fertile land and fresh starts. They came with wagons full of tools, livestock, and certainty about how things should be done. By September, 42 families had staked their claims on the steep valley slopes, building homes that stood in neat rows like dominoes waiting to fall. Marcus Stone arrived in late August with his wife Elena and their 2 children. As the settlement's appointed building inspector, Marcus took pride in enforcing proper construction standards. Every cabin needed square corners, level floors, and walls that met at precise 90-degree angles. This was civilization, after all, not some haphazard collection of hovels. His reputation for exacting standards had followed him from the Eastern Territories, and the settlers of Pine Ridge appreciated his commitment to order and uniformity. When Dakota arrived in early September, Marcus knew immediately there would be problems. The native man came alone, leading a single horse loaded with tools and lumber. He was tall and lean, with gray threading through his long, dark hair and hands that moved with the deliberate economy of someone who never wasted motion. He spoke English clearly but sparingly, and when he inquired about available land, Marcus directed him to the steepest section of the valley, a 40-degree slope that everyone agreed was unsuitable for proper construction. "You'll need to terrace that land extensively," Marcus warned him. "Level foundation is absolutely essential for structural integrity." Dakota studied the slope for a long moment, running his fingers through the soil and examining the angle of the trees growing there. "This land is good," he said finally. "I will build here." Construction began 3 days later, and within hours Marcus received his first complaint. Thomas Brennan, whose cabin sat on the choice flatland near the stream, came to report that the native builder was violating every principle of sound construction. His foundation posts weren't level. His walls leaned at impossible angles. Nothing was square or straight or remotely acceptable. Marcus climbed the slope to investigate, bringing his level and measuring tools. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Dakota was indeed building something, but it bore no resemblance to proper architecture. The foundation posts were set at varying angles, creating what looked like a drunken attempt at construction. Some leaned uphill, others downhill, and none stood vertical to the ground. "This won't pass inspection," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "You need to start over with a proper foundation." Dakota continued working, fitting a curved beam into place with careful precision. "This foundation is proper," he replied without looking up. "My grandfather taught me. His grandfather taught him. Many winters, many buildings. All stood strong." "I'm sure they did their best with limited knowledge," Marcus said, trying to sound patient. "But we have engineering principles now, mathematics and physics that prove the correct way to build. Level foundations, square walls, straight support beams. These aren't suggestions, they're requirements for safety." For the first time, Dakota met his eyes directly. "The mountain does not care about your mathematics," he said quietly. "The mountain has its own requirements." Word spread quickly through the settlement about the strange construction taking place on the steep slope. Families made excuses to walk past Dakota's building site, shaking their heads at the peculiar angles and curves. Children pointed and giggled. Women whispered concerns about what such carelessness might mean for their community's reputation. Thomas Brennan started taking bets on when the structure would collapse. "Give it until the first snow," he predicted confidently. "Those crazy angles can't possibly support any weight." But Dakota continued his work with unwavering focus. Each morning he climbed above his building site and spent an hour studying the upper slopes. He examined snow patterns from the previous winter, traced his fingers along tree bark, and tested the soil at various elevations. Marcus observed these rituals with growing frustration. The man was wasting time on superstitious nonsense when he should be fixing his foundation. As September turned to October, Dakota's cabin took shape in ways that defied conventional understanding. The walls didn't rise straight up. They curved inward and outward like a basket woven by unsteady hands. The roof resembled a turtle's shell, dipping and rising in irregular patterns that hurt the eye. Most disturbing of all, the entire structure seemed to sway slightly, even on calm days, as if breathing with some invisible rhythm. "It's an embarrassment," Marcus told Elena one evening. "I've tried explaining proper techniques, but he refuses to listen. Claims his grandfather's methods are superior to modern engineering. Elena, who had been watching the construction from their kitchen window, looked thoughtful. His grandfather survived in these mountains for how long? That's not the point, Marcus replied. We've advanced beyond trial and error. We have science now. Elena said, turning back to her cooking. But her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. The settlement's weekly meetings became opportunities for communal mockery. Thomas Brennan gave dramatic updates on the Leaning Tower of Lunacy, complete with exaggerated predictions of imminent collapse. Marcus found himself defending his decision to allow the construction to continue, though he had doubts himself. Part of him wanted to order the entire structure demolished, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the calm certainty in Dakota's eyes, or the precise care with which every crooked beam was placed. Young Jacob Miller started watching the construction more carefully than the others. At 17, he was apprenticing with Marcus and learning the building trade. Unlike the older settlers who simply laughed and moved on, Jacob found himself returning to Dakota's site repeatedly, studying the unusual techniques with genuine curiosity. One afternoon, he worked up the courage to ask questions. Why do you curve the support beams instead of keeping them straight? He asked. Wouldn't straight beams be stronger? Dakota looked at him with what might have been approval. You see a tree in the forest, he said. Does it grow straight and rigid or does it bend with the wind? It bends, Jacob admitted. And which trees survive the strongest storms? The rigid ones that fight the wind or the flexible ones that dance with it? Jacob considered this. The flexible ones, I suppose. The rigid ones snap. Your cabins are like rigid trees, Dakota continued. They stand proud and straight, fighting against the mountain. But the mountain always wins against things that will not bend. What do you mean? Jacob asked. What's the mountain going to do? Dakota returned his attention to his work and Jacob thought he wouldn't answer. But after a long moment, the older man spoke again. The mountain holds much snow up there, he said, gesturing to the slopes above the settlement. Every winter it decides what to keep and what to send down. This winter I think it will send down very much. The comment troubled Jacob, though he wasn't sure why. That evening he mentioned it to Marcus, who dismissed the concern immediately. Old superstitions, Marcus said. These mountains have held snow for thousands of years. There's no reason to think this winter will be any different. But it was different, though the signs were subtle. October brought warmer temperatures than usual, followed by heavy snowfall that created unusual layering in the high snowpack. Dakota noticed, spending more time studying the upper slopes and less time working on his nearly complete cabin. His expression grew increasingly troubled. On the morning of October 28th, Dakota did something unprecedented. He walked directly to Marcus Stone's cabin and requested an emergency town meeting. The snow above is wrong, he said urgently. Warm days made ice beneath new snow. Wind is adding weight in bad places. The mountain is ready to let go. Marcus stared at him. You're saying we're at risk of an avalanche? Not at risk, Dakota corrected. It is certain. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe 3 days. But it comes. The town meeting that afternoon was the largest attendance Marcus had ever seen. News of the avalanche warning had spread quickly, and families packed into the community hall with expressions ranging from concern to amusement. Thomas Brennan made no effort to hide his laughter. Let me understand this correctly, Thomas said loudly. The man who can't build a straight wall is now predicting avalanches? The same man who thinks his crooked shack will withstand a strong breeze. The crowd's laughter encouraged him to continue. Maybe his grandfather's ghost told him. Or perhaps he read it in the tree bark during one of his morning ceremonies. Marcus called for order, but the damage was done. The meeting dissolved into mockery, with several families making jokes about moving higher up the slope to escape Dakota's curse. Even Marcus found it difficult to take the warning seriously. The snow on the upper slopes looked stable, and there were no visible signs of danger that he could see. Only Jacob Miller remained thoughtful. After the meeting dispersed, he approached Dakota privately. Will you show me what you're seeing? He asked. I want to understand. Dakota studied the young man's face, then nodded. Come, I will show you how to read what the mountain is saying. They climbed together to a ridge overlooking the settlement, where Dakota pointed out details that Jacob's untrained eyes had missed. The subtle color variations in the snow that indicated different densities. The hairline cracks that had appeared overnight, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The way the recent snowfall sat on top of an icy layer created by the warm spell. with no proper bonding between the layers. "See there," Dakota said, pointing to a section of slope that looked identical to Jacob's eyes. "That snow wants to move. It is heavy and sitting on ice. It waits only for a reason, more weight or temperature change or vibration. Something will give it permission, and then it will not stop until it reaches the bottom." Jacob felt his stomach tighten as understanding dawned. "The settlement is right in its path." "Yes," Dakota said simply. "That is why I built where I built, the way I built. My cabin will bend when the snow comes. Your cabins will break." That evening, Jacob tried to warn his neighbors, carefully avoiding any mention of native wisdom or traditional knowledge. He spoke only about what he'd seen, the cracks, the layering, the unstable snowpack. But his efforts backfired spectacularly. By morning, he found himself grouped with Dakota as another target for ridicule. Marcus pulled him aside after breakfast. "Jacob, I'm disappointed. You're a bright young man with a future in this profession. Don't throw that away by chasing superstitions. We have real engineering knowledge, not folklore and fear-mongering." The social pressure was crushing. Jacob's other apprentice friends stopped including him in their activities. Families who had promised him work after his apprenticeship ended sent messages canceling their agreements. The settlement's message was clear: believe in proper science and society or lose your place in both. Within 2 days, Jacob publicly apologized for his temporary lack of judgment. The settlement celebrated his return to reason with a communal dinner that pointedly excluded both him and Dakota. But Dakota had not given up. Each morning he climbed higher, studying the fracture lines that grew longer and more pronounced with each passing day. He began moving his possessions out of his cabin to a shelter he'd constructed even higher up the mountain, in a location that would be above the avalanche path. The settlers noticed and added it to their entertainment, speculating about whether he was abandoning his ridiculous cabin or simply losing his mind. On the morning of November the 2nd, Dakota made one final attempt. He positioned himself in the settlement center and began shouting warnings in both English and his native tongue, pointing repeatedly at the mountainside and gesturing for people to move to higher ground. His desperation was so intense that several young children began crying. Thomas Brennan had enough. "You're disturbing the peace," he shouted. "This is a civilized community, and we won't have your constant doomsaying terrorizing our families." A group of men escorted Dakota to the settlement boundary, but instead of leaving, he climbed to a rocky outcrop where he could watch both the mountainside and the settlement below. The fracture lines had connected overnight, creating a continuous crack nearly a quarter-mile long. The mountain was balanced on the edge, held only by friction, and the warming afternoon temperature was about to eliminate even that. At 2:47 p.m. on November 2nd, the sound began. Marcus was in his workshop, reviewing building plans for the spring expansion, when his tools began vibrating on the workbench. The vibration grew stronger, accompanied by a deep rumble that seemed to come from inside the earth itself. He stepped outside, confused, and looked up the mountain. What he saw made his mind refuse to process the information for several critical seconds. The entire mountainside was moving, flowing downward like a white river, gathering speed and mass as it descended. Trees that had stood for decades snapped like matchsticks. Boulders the size of wagons tumbled within the churning mass. And the sound was unlike anything he'd ever heard. A combination of thunder and breaking glass and screaming wind all compressed into one deafening roar. "Avalanche!" Someone screamed, and the settlement exploded into chaos. Families poured from their cabins, screaming for children and grabbing loved ones. Some ran toward the stream, others toward the forest. Many simply stood frozen in terror. Marcus snatched up his daughter Sarah and sprinted toward higher ground, yelling for Elena and his son Thomas to follow. The roar grew louder with each second, and when he risked a glance back, he saw the white wall bearing down on them with impossible speed. Jacob Miller grabbed his younger siblings and ran toward the rocky outcrop where he'd last seen Dakota, some instinct telling him the native man might know where safety lay. They scrambled up the rocks just as the avalanche reached the first row of cabins. The destruction was absolute and terrifyingly swift. The first cabin simply vanished, swallowed whole by thousands of tons of moving snow and debris. Thomas Brennan's perfect home, built to every regulation, disappeared in under 3 seconds. The neat rows of identical structures that had represented civilization and progress were erased as thoroughly as chalk marks in rain. Marcus watched in horror as his own cabin, built with his own hands according to every principle he knew, was crushed to splinters. The structure that had taken 4 months to build was destroyed in less than 5 seconds. Around the settlement, the same scene repeated itself. 42 families' worth of careful construction, all reduced to scattered lumber and broken dreams. But in the center of the devastation, something impossible was happening. Dakota's crooked cabin, the structure that everyone had predicted would collapse at the first strong wind, was still standing. As the avalanche struck it, the building began to move in ways that defied belief. The angled walls that had looked so wrong were bending with the force instead of breaking against it. The curved roof was shedding snow and debris like water rolling off stone. Most remarkably, the entire structure was tilting and shifting as its foundation adjusted, but it remained fundamentally intact. From his position on the outcrop, Dakota watched the cabin perform exactly as his grandfather's wisdom had taught him to build it. But his relief was overwhelmed by grief for the people who had refused to listen. The avalanche lasted less than 4 minutes, but when it stopped, the settlement looked like a snow-covered battlefield. And scattered across that battlefield were the survivors who had learned too late that wisdom sometimes wears unexpected faces. In the sudden, terrible silence, voices began calling for help from beneath the snow. Dakota moved down the slope immediately, his movements careful but urgent. Every second mattered, but rushing blindly would create more casualties. He'd trained for this scenario his entire life, learning from his grandfather's stories about winter, rescues, and how to read the subtle signs that indicated where people might still be, breathing beneath the snow. The first survivor he found was Marcus, Stone's daughter Sarah, trapped but alive beneath a section of collapsed wall that had created an air pocket. Dakota dug her out with his bare hands, wrapped her in his coat, and carried her to his cabin, the only standing structure left. The interior was warm and dry, the fire still burning in a fireplace designed to withstand far more than most people could imagine. One by one, he pulled survivors from the wreckage. Elena Stone injured but conscious, Jacob Miller and his siblings bruised but whole, Thomas Brennan pulled from beneath his shop with a broken arm and a shattered expression. Each rescue taught the survivors something they should have learned months earlier. The man they'd mocked possessed knowledge that was saving their lives. As the cabin filled with injured and traumatized people, the structure that had been derided as primitive proved perfectly suited for its new role. The slanted walls created natural air circulation. The flexible framework absorbed the movement and weight of many people without stress. The curved roof design provided optimal insulation, keeping everyone warm despite the disaster outside. Marcus Stone was among the last rescued, pulled from beneath his collapsed workshop with a deep gash on his forehead and shock in his eyes. As Dakota cleaned and bandaged his wound with practiced efficiency, Marcus found himself face to face with the man he'd spent months dismissing. The native builder worked without speaking, his movements gentle and precise. When their eyes met, Marcus saw no anger or satisfaction, only focused compassion. By evening, Dakota's cabin housed 19 survivors. As they huddled around the fire, conversations began that should have happened months earlier. People asked about his building techniques, his grandfather's knowledge, the signs in the snow they'd dismissed. Dakota answered every question patiently, explaining the principles behind each design choice. "Why didn't you force us to listen?" Marcus asked finally, his voice raw. "You knew this would happen. You could have made us evacuate." Dakota fed another log into the fire before answering. "A man cannot make another see what he refuses to look at," he said quietly. "Wisdom must be chosen, not forced. I hoped you would choose. I was wrong about when the mountain would move. I thought we had more time." The silence that followed was heavy with grief and understanding. 3 days later, when rescue parties from neighboring settlements arrived with supplies and medical assistance, a transformation had already begun. The survivors weren't just grateful to be alive, they were ready to rebuild differently. Marcus Stone, his head still bandaged, was the first to make the request. "Will you teach us?" he asked Dakota. "Teach us to build the way your grandfather taught you. Teach us to read the mountain and work with it instead of against it." Dakota studied the faces around him, faces that now showed genuine respect and humility instead of mockery. "Knowledge is meant to be shared," he said finally, "but only with those who approach it with open hearts. I will teach you, The education began the next morning. Dakota led a group up the mountainside to examine the avalanche path, showing them how to recognize unstable conditions and understand what had happened. More importantly, he explained how his people had learned over generations to work with natural forces rather than resist them. Jacob Miller emerged as the most dedicated student, asking detailed questions and taking careful notes. The young man who had been pressured into abandoning his convictions was determined never to make that mistake again. As they worked together, a genuine friendship developed, one that would reshape not just buildings but an entire community's understanding of wisdom and progress. The rebuilding became a true collaboration. Dakota taught them to read the land's natural patterns and build in harmony with them. The settlers contributed their knowledge of tools and resource management, creating more efficient ways to implement traditional techniques. The resulting structures combined wisdom and innovation in ways neither culture had achieved independently. Elena Stone coordinated the reconstruction effort with the same efficiency she'd once used for social events, but now her energy built bridges instead of walls. Even the children participated, learning to test wood by listening to its sound and observe weather patterns with attention their parents had never taught them. As winter deepened and new buildings took shape, the settlement developed a fundamentally different character. Conversations included discussions of traditional weather prediction, alongside debates about lumber grades. Dakota found himself consulted not just on construction, but on hunting patterns, food preservation, and dozens of survival skills his people had perfected over centuries. When spring visitors arrived from other settlements, they barely recognized Pine Ridge. Instead of identical cabins in military precision, they found an organic arrangement of flexible structures that seemed to grow naturally from the mountainside. Engineers traveled from distant territories to study the unique construction methods born from collaboration instead of conquest. By the first anniversary of the avalanche, Pine Ridge had become something unprecedented. Dakota's original cabin had been preserved as both a practical shelter and a teaching center. Universities sent students to study its innovative design, spreading knowledge far beyond the mountain community where it had been saved by one man's patience and an entire community's painful lesson in humility. On quiet evenings, Dakota would share other stories his grandfather had told him, tales of seasons when cooperation meant survival, of ancient understandings that wisdom belonged to everyone. The settlement had become living proof that progress didn't require abandoning tradition, that innovation could honor the past while building toward the future. Marcus Stone, working alongside Dakota to develop new building techniques, had discovered something his engineering education never taught him, that combining precision with traditional principles produced results superior to either approach alone. His partnership with Dakota had become the community's defining example, proof that respect could replace rivalry when people chose wisdom over pride. Jacob Miller had established himself as the settlement's official weather reader. Using the forecasting methods Dakota taught him to predict seasonal changes weeks in advance. His accurate predictions saved crops and prevented livestock losses. The young man who'd once abandoned his convictions now stood as the person everyone turned to when nature's patterns needed interpretation. The children growing up with both settler skills and traditional wisdom represented the settlement's greatest achievement. They moved through the forest with quiet confidence, understanding their environment rather than fearing it. They built shelters as easily as they split firewood, read weather signs as naturally as they read books, and treated cultural differences as sources of strength rather than division. As Dakota stood on the ridge where he'd once watched alone, trying to warn people who wouldn't listen, he saw the fulfillment of his grandfather's teaching. Knowledge shared generously and received humbly created something greater than its parts. The crooked cabin that had saved their lives had become the foundation for a community that would endure whatever challenges the future might bring. Built on the unshakable bedrock of mutual respect and shared wisdom, the mountain had taught them all a lesson written in snow and survival, that sometimes the things that look wrong are exactly right, and the wisdom we need most often comes from the places we least expect to find it.